All right, folks, so I have the honor and pleasure of introducing a key player in our movement. Many of you know Dr. John Draper, who's the Chief Clinical Officer of Mental Health Association of New York City. So he's part of Paul's organization, right?
We're an affiliate.
We are an affiliate, okay. And John wears several hats, including Mental Health of New York. Well, I'll have you, why don't you tell them?
I'm also the director of the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, which is the capacity that I'm here with you all today. How nice. And thank you all for supporting us.
Yeah, so pull out of your packet. Remember we talked about the one-pagers? This is the infographic that you're going to bring to the Hill tomorrow. So, John, Bob and Christine, I believe, are on one of your advisory groups. And so tell us, by the way, how many people are veterans, meaning they've been to a previous forum? Okay. And then how many are newbies? Yeah, so half the people are brand new to the forum. So why don't you tell us as succinctly as possible how the Lifeline operates and what it does?
I'm happy to do that and happy to be here with you all. So the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, which is funded by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, is this nation's public health safety net for people who are in emotional and suicidal crisis. So anybody can call from anywhere at any time in the United States for free and be connected to a trained counselor at an accredited crisis center. It's a national portal for local services. So when you phone this national number, the single national number, 800-273-TALK or 8255, when you call that number, it routes you to the nearest crisis center to you in the hopes that you can be connected to local services, which we think is typically the best case scenario. And if that center is busy, then the calls roll over to a national backup center to make sure that all calls are answered.
Beautiful. So how many people do you estimate that you help each year?
Boy, since we started in 2005, and we is, again, SAMHSA and the Mental Health Association of New York City, we've been administering the grant, had the privilege of doing so since 2005. Since then, we have helped over 10.5 million callers. This year alone, we expect about 1.8 million calls will be answered, and about 60% of those calls, according to recent surveys of our crisis centers, appear to be individuals that talk about being suicidal. So that's a really significant number of people who are in suicidal crisis that we're helping.
Well, obviously, it's the name speaks for itself, right? So as a component of your operation, veterans, when they call into the Lifeline, how are they handled? Well,
some of you probably know a little bit about the Veterans Crisis Line, but how that works with the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, you may not know. When, in 2007, the VA decided to establish the Veterans Crisis Line, at that time it was called the Veterans Suicide Prevention Hotline. At that time, they signed an interagency agreement with SAMHSA so they could use the 800-273-TALK number as the national number. So there'd be one number for all Americans who are in crisis. So when you call that number, you receive an automated greeting that says, press 1 if you are a veteran or a member of military service. And then it sends that call to one of two large centers that the VA pays for, that is in Canandaigua and Atlanta. And they've helped about 2.8 million callers since 2007. Those press 1 callers, veterans and members of military service. But what a lot of people don't know is that if you don't press 1, some veterans don't want to talk with the VA. And so they have the option to not press 1 and talk to one of our local centers. Plus, all of our local centers have a variety of other lines. For many of you who may know your local crisis center, I hope you do, you'll know that they don't just answer the Lifeline. In fact, about 85% of their calls come in from other local lines, and on those lines, they're also serving veterans. So between the VA and our crisis centers, we are serving veterans and members of military service around the country. We estimate about 300,000 additional veterans and members of military service are being helped by our crisis centers around the country locally. So between them and the VA, we leverage all of our national resources to help as many veterans as possible.
Good, but that's a great segue into my next question. It's the funding. So who pays for the Lifeline, and does somebody else pay for the veteran portion? And if so, what's the dichotomy
That's
between the funding?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. The VA takes care of veterans and therefore takes care of the Veterans Crisis Line calls. So they pay the toll-free cost for that. They pay for all those calls to be answered by the Veterans Crisis Line centers in Atlanta and Canandaigua. And SAMHSA pays for our administration of the line, but none of the local centers, and there's about 160 in the national network now, none of them are funded federally to answer the calls. So they're funded very differently. The VA's about close to $80 million that they receive annually to take care of those calls, and about 1/10 of that is what SAMHSA receives in federal funding to support the Lifeline to answer about twice as many calls.
So how do you do it?
Well, we depend on a network that is locally funded. So for those of you who are working locally, please keep an eye on your local crisis centers. Many of them are under-resourced. I'd say we do pretty well in terms of our answer rates overall. But there's some states are not doing so well. Some states do not have enough resources at their crisis centers to be able to answer Lifeline calls. So those calls are rolling out of state and being answered and burdening other states who don't have the local know-how that your local crisis centers do. So really finding a way to better support your local crisis centers is something I really want to emphasize.
Which is why John's here and why this is one of our asks tomorrow. We'll explore it further. So you said the calls are increasing. How do people learn about the number?
Well, it's one of the great things about having one national number. So whenever there's something national that happens, like Robin Williams kills himself, or there's a major media event, there's one number that goes around the media. So whether it's print or broadcast media, you'll see our number in print. That would be a lot harder if these were different numbers around. So every media representative has one number. Google, when you do a search for suicide, immediately, for those of you who know, who've done a Google search and you put suicide in there, the Lifeline number pops up. If you're on Siri and you tell Siri that you're thinking about suicide, Siri will tell you to call the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. If you're on Facebook and you're in need of help, again, Facebook will tell you to call the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. So having that one national number helps all of us who are trying to get the right people who are in crisis to the right place at the right time. And essentially, that's also why the Veterans Crisis Line works so well with us, is because there's only one number that we have to promote. And so every time something happens with someone like Robin Williams or some other tragedy, that also allows veterans' calls to be answered. So it's a terrific kind of one-stop shopping scenario.
Okay. John, can you tell us more about the Lifeline as a life-saving service, and how do you know it works? When our advocates go to the Hill tomorrow and we're asking for an increase in the appropriations, why should Congress increase the funding?
It's an important question. There's so much competition for mental health dollars. It's important to know that calls to Lifeline have been validated as a means for reducing emotional distress and suicidality. Not just reducing suicidality, which alone is huge, but also reducing emotional distress, so it can help people further upstream. So we're finding that through these evaluations, and they've consistently shown that the Lifeline is effectively reducing suicidality and distress in callers, that this is a way for people to get care around the clock for free, even if they can't get to their local mental health clinic.
So would it be fair to say it's not just life-saving, but it's cost-saving?
Absolutely. In fact, I mean, that's a great point. It's we would like to say that our crisis centers can and should be paid more for what they do, but considering what you get right now, it's a considerable cost-efficient way of helping people. We're finding that it diverts people from unnecessary use of emergency departments and other crisis and emergency resources. It keeps law enforcement at bay when they don't need to be knocking on the door of somebody in suicidal crisis. They will only be dispatched if they have to be. So it's a great way of diverting a lot of these unnecessary calls from crisis and law enforcement.
I think another important part of your contract is that you provide best practices. Can you share with the group again what that means and what that actually gives people across the country?
You know, I think this is one of the advantages of having a national network of local crisis centers. I mean, we could have a national center or a couple of national centers. The downside of that is that as we find out what's the best way to prevent suicide and working with researchers and getting field consensus with experts as we do, it would just sit at that national call center. Instead, we disseminate those best practices to all the local crisis centers who can then act as ambassadors locally to spread and work with you all to spread knowledge of best practices to local providers. And they do a lot of trainings and outreach and education too, which hopefully you know and feel free to partner with them in doing so.
So I think those are really key takeaways. So it's not just a life-saving service, it's a cost-saving service. You provide best practices on a very slim budget, but the fact is that right now, quite frankly, it's a shoestring budget.
That's right, and you know, there's actually it's interesting. Some of you may have heard about this Hatch-Stewart bill that's been introduced, the National Suicide Prevention Hotline Improvement Act.
Also, the Joe Donnelly from Indiana folks are here.
Oh, that's right.
Okay,
that's
and
right.
Eddie Bernice Johnson from Texas they're both the Democratic sponsors in the Senate and the House, respectively.
But in thinking about what it basically is asking there to be a study, the FCC to study whether or not to make an N11 number, such as 611 or 411, become the National Crisis and Suicide Prevention Lifeline number. There's a lot of, I mean, obviously if it's properly resourced, like 911 centers perhaps, it's a tremendous idea. If you think about in terms of getting immediate access for people, it's not only, what is it, about 11 to 12 million people have suicidal ideation each year, and we're reaching about 1.8 million. We're not getting everybody. So we need to have better access. And the other thing I think is important is if it's right up there with 911, we could be diverting unnecessary calls to 911 and saving those resources. They should be calling us instead because we're trained in actually de-escalating people over the phone and preventing them from using emergency resources. So it would really be a cost-saving approach for us nationally.
Good. And when we got the call from Senator Hatch's office and Congressman Stewart's office, they had the first part down. They wanted to look into what was the probability or the viability of creating a 3-digit number. And we said, you know, that's a really great idea, but if you make it easier to call and there's no one to answer the phone on the other side, you're creating a larger problem. So they've agreed to, they added to the legislation, which we're going to ask tomorrow when you go to the Hill, your other senators and representatives to co-sponsor it. They're going to do a study. They're going to work with John and his team to see what's actually going on right now, how the programs are evaluated, and they promised us once the study is done on the current services, what's the probability of changing it to a 3-digit number. Then they're committed to finding us the money to properly fund an expanded hotline.
Now, has it or has it not been passed yet? I mean,
No,
it's not been passed.
No,
so
it's just,
I'll hear about it. When it's passed,
you will.
Because I got to help them study it. Yeah,
Well, you will,
so,
and I think Utah is unfortunately one of the 5 top states in terms of completed suicides. So on a fun note, when you and I were talking last week, I am so out of it that there's a pop singer whose name is Logic. Is that correct? So why don't you tell us who Logic is?
How many people know what John is talking about here? All right, so typically what happens in our field is some television show or movie or something, or even a newspaper story will come out that just is horrifying to us, that it's a terrible example of media exploitation of suicide, and then we have to clean up the mess afterwards. This is just the opposite, where we got a positive surprise. No one told us that hip-hop star Logic, I barely heard of him, Logic had produced this song that's called 800-273-8255. And this song is about somebody who calls the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline who wants to die. The caller hears the person say the right things, just what he needs to hear. And by the end of the song says, "I want to live." And that is the chorus as people are singing about, I want to live. And he gets the whole crowd going up on this. When he came to visit us in the office the other day, I said, "What's it like when you play it live?" And he said, "Oh, it's wild. Everybody is singing. I stopped singing after the second verse because everyone else is singing this." And to give you a sense of its impact on our service, we had on the day it dropped, we had the largest call volume in our history outside of when Robin Williams killed himself. We've seen the call numbers continue to be higher, much higher than usual. The Google search results for our number have gone through the roof. Our website hits 100,000 more a month. It's been uncanny. And again, this is an example of positive messaging, which we don't hear very often. It's a message of hope. I would say he's a hip-hop artist.
I tell you, these guys from New York, they have quite the, yeah. All right, I'm going to squeeze two quick questions in because these are really good. This is from someone in the audience. She wrote, she's a mom of an officer. Are you or have you been working directly with law enforcement to reduce their calls and assist them? They are overwhelmed with calls, and you had talked about that.
Yeah, we have been, and actually need to do more of that. We'd like to do that at a national level. A lot of our crisis centers are working closely to train officers, actually, in how to approach people who are suicidal. And our work, we've shown, can actually reduce the unnecessary interface of officers with persons who are suicidal. About 40% of the people who are at imminent risk of suicide, we're able to de-escalate to a point where they don't need any rescue services at all, including in law enforcement.
Cool. Next quick question. Do you think you'll ever partner with other crisis lines like the Trans Lifeline or the Trevor Project?
Well, both of them are on our Consumer Survivor Committee. That we partner with them to the extent that our crisis centers make referrals to them. The reason they can't be a part of our network is that they only answer calls for a specific population. If there was significant funding that they provided, like the Veterans Crisis Line that was federal, then we might be able to have like a press 2 or 3 or 4 option. But the fewer, I mean, think about how many press options we could have. There would be so many for so many special populations. So instead, we just tell all of our crisis centers about these services, and then they are educated about how they can warm transfer to those services. And those services receive a number of calls from our folks who transfer callers over to them.
Okay, last question. How many crisis centers are in your network? What kind of support might be available for states or localities that would like to establish a center?
There's about 160 plus crisis centers in our national network, hopefully growing over the next year. We'd like to see it grow considerably more. And states, but again, a lot of them are struggling just to provide funding for their local crisis centers. We would love to see if there would be perhaps more federal supports, but also a way to more efficiently spend their funding. I mean, maybe if they have less of it, there might be more efficient ways, and we'd be happy to talk with them about how they might do that.
Okay, so how many of you are willing to go to the Hill tomorrow, talk about hip hope, and talk about the fact that the crisis lines are underfunded and that we need to put our money where our mouth is? So let's thank John.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.